They woke before sunrise with bodies aching from wounds that never quite healed. They ate scraps when they ate at all, slept in rooms without windows, lost their teeth before the age of 25, and did all of this to survive one more day in a society that branded them as unclean while secretly seeking them out. This is the story of prostitutes in the Old Testament. Place it in the context of the ancient Near East. 1400 years before Christ, the walled cities of Canaan, Moab, Edom, Philistia, the narrow streets where sewage ran open in the sun, the mud brick houses packed tight against the city wall. And in the middle of that world, in specific alleys, in houses marked in specific ways, lived women whom society called by two different names in Hebrew. Zona, the common prostitute. Kadesha, the prostitute of the pagan cults. The difference between the two will emerge shortly, and it changed everything about the way those women were treated. There is also a promise not yet visible. One of them would become a direct ancestor of the Messiah himself. Consider the concrete situation of such a woman. In the vast majority of cases, she did not choose that life. Archaeological records and the legal texts of the period show three main pathways that led a woman there. The first was widowhood without children. A woman who lost her husband young and had not given birth to a male heir was left without legal protection. No male heir, no inheritance, no inheritance, no house, no house, no food. The second pathway was divorce on suspicion. All it took was the husband handing over a bill of divorce, as described in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, and the woman was expelled with no right to any material property. The third pathway was sale by her own family. Impoverished fathers, unable to pay their debts, handed daughters over as payment. The records from the Code of Hammurabi and the Nutzi texts show this type of transaction occurring on an impressive scale, and none of those pathways was an isolated accident. Consider the magnitude of daily physical exposure. The archaeologists who excavated Canaanite cities such as Hazor and Megiddo found clusters of houses with small rooms, approximately 3 meters by 3 meters, equipped with nothing more than a bed of stone or rough-hewn wood. In some of those rooms, specific artifacts were found: small figurines of fertility deities, fragments of incense burners, remnants of offerings. A woman who worked in those rooms received between 15 and 30 visitors per day during peak periods of activity, according to estimates based on cuneiform economic records. 15 to 30 men per day, in a cubicle without adequate ventilation, with internal temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius during the summer months. Follow the process of illness. The Egyptian medical texts of the Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 years before Christ, describe with precision several symptoms now identified as sexually transmitted diseases. Genital sores that do not close, painful swelling in the groin, skin eruptions on the trunk and hands, recurring fevers, hair loss, progressive blindness in advanced stages. Skeletal remains exhumed from communal cemeteries in the region display clear patterns of bone erosion, consistent with chronic infection in women who died between the ages of 22 and 30. The average life expectancy of a Canaanite or Israelite prostitute of the period did not exceed 28 years. 28 years, that was the ceiling of life. Grasp the scale of the nutritional challenge. A woman in that condition rarely had access to fresh bread. She ate leftover boiled barley, bitter lentils, heavily salted fish in advanced stages of decomposition. Bones analyzed at archaeological sites from the period show unmistakable signs of chronic malnutrition, with scurvy, iron deficiency, anemia, and rickets appearing in considerably higher proportions than in the general female population of the same era. The weakened body made infections more aggressive. The infections made the body weaker still, and the cycle closed around her. Notice the scene of social division that the law established. The text of Leviticus chapter 21 verse 9 decreed something brutal and specific. The daughter of a priest who prostituted herself would be burned with fire. No other female crime carried that specific penalty. The reason was not only moral, it was about ritual purity and the protection of the priestly household's name. But the practical effect was that any woman born into a priestly family lived under the threat of death by incineration if she fell into that life, even out of economic desperation. The common prostitute, the zoner, on the other hand, was marginalized but tolerated. She could live, she could move about. She could even be sought out through legal proceedings, as the story of Tamar will demonstrate. And that tolerance had an important political reason behind it. Examine the details of the second category, the Kedeshah. She was the cultic prostitute, bound to the pagan temples of Asherah, Baal, and Astarte. The text of Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 17 and 18 expressly forbids the existence of this type of woman in Israel, and further forbids that her wages be brought to the house of the Lord, calling that payment the price of a dog. The language is harsh, because the problem was twofold. The Kedeshah did not offer only her body. She offered a link to foreign deities in a fertility ritual that bound the man who sought her to a religious system opposed to the worship of Yahweh. The excavators of Ras Shamra in the ancient territory of Ugarit found clay tablets describing these rituals in detail. Consecrated women who lived within the temple complexes. They received visitors in small chambers annexed to the sanctuary. They handed over part of their payment to the priests of the deity. They functioned, in practice, as an instrument of religious recruitment. The difference between Zonah and Kedeshah, therefore, was not merely legal, it was theological. Consider now a specific scene from the book of Genesis, chapter 38. Tamar, daughter-in-law of Judah, watched her husband die without leaving a son. Under the custom of levirate marriage, the younger brother of the husband was required to take her as wife in order to ensure descendants. The brother refused to fulfill that duty properly, and he too died. Judah, out of fear, sent Tamar back to her father's house as a widow, promising to give her the third son when he reached the proper age. Time passed. The third son grew up. Judah did not keep his word. Tamar understood what was happening. She was being left to grow old without descendants and without rights. And then she made a decision which the biblical text records, without immediate moral judgment. She covered her face with a veil, sat at the entrance of Enaim, and waited. Judah passed by. He believed her to be a common prostitute. He negotiated payment. A kid from the flock. Since he did not have the animal with him at the time, he left as a pledge his signet, his cord, and his staff. 3 months later, it was discovered that Tamar was pregnant. Judah ordered her burned for adultery, since she was still considered the legal bride of his third son. That was when she sent the 3 objects back with a message. By the man to whom these belong, I am with child. Judah recognized his own possessions, and he spoke a phrase that changed the entire case. She is more righteous than I, because I did not give her to my son Shelah. From that pregnancy were born Perez and Zerah, and from Perez would descend Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David, and from David, 1,000 years later, Christ himself. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 1 verse 3 records the name of Tamar directly in the genealogy of the Messiah. The woman who dressed as a prostitute to claim justice entered the lineage of the promise. Follow now another story in another city with another woman. Jericho, approximately 1406 years before Christ. A double wall encircling the city, roughly 4 to 5 meters thick between the 2 parallel structures. Houses built directly on top of that structure. In one of them lived Rahab, described by the Hebrew text of the book of Joshua chapter 2 as Zonah, a common prostitute. When two Israelite spies entered the city for reconnaissance, it was her house they sought, not by chance. It was one of the few places where the arrival of strangers drew no attention, where men came and went without needing to explain themselves. Rahab hid them under bundles of flax stalks laid out to dry on the roof. When the king of Jericho's messengers came to her door demanding the surrender of the spies, she lied. She said they had left before the city gates closed, and in exchange for her protection, she asked that her entire family be spared when the Israelites took the city. The spies agreed on one condition: she must tie a scarlet cord in the window. That red thread would serve as a sign of protection when the invading army arrived. The city fell 7 days later, according to the account in Joshua chapter 6. The walls collapsed, the Israelites entered, and every house was destroyed. Only the section where Rahab's house stood remained intact, and she and all her family were brought out alive. More than that, Rahab was incorporated into the people of Israel, married Salmon, and bore a son named Boaz, the same Boaz who would marry Ruth. Together they produced Obed, father of Jesse, father of David. The text of Matthew chapter 1 verse 5 places Rahab in the genealogy of the Messiah. Two prostitutes, two lines converging on the same family tree. Consider the setting of another scene, now inside the palace in Jerusalem, approximately 970 years before Christ. King Solomon, newly crowned, receives two women described by the text of the first book of Kings, chapter 3, verse 16, as Zonoth, the plural of Zona. Two prostitutes. They lived in the same house, without any other man there with them. Each had given birth to a baby 3 days apart. During the night, one of the babies died. The mother of the dead baby silently swapped the children, placing the lifeless body beside the sleeping other mother and taking the living son for herself. In the morning, the other mother woke to nurse, realized the baby beside her was not her own, and the dispute that ended before the king began. Solomon ordered a sword brought. He said he would divide the living child into 2 parts. The false mother immediately agreed. The true mother chose to lose the child rather than see him killed. Solomon gave the child to the one who had chosen the life of her son, even at the cost of her own pain. The text records that the whole nation heard of the decision and came to fear the king for the wisdom of God that was in him. Notice a detail that typically goes overlooked. The 2 women entered the palace. They spoke directly to the king. They were heard. In a society where the female voice did not always carry the same legal weight as the male, 2 common prostitutes obtained a royal audience and had their case judged personally by the monarch. The legal system of Israel, compared to the rest of the ancient Near East, afforded this category of woman more room to speak than is generally imagined today. But daily life remained brutal. Consider the magnitude of weekly physical wear. A prostitute of the Iron Age worked between 14 and 16 hours per day, with no weekly day of rest and no support in the event of an unwanted pregnancy. Spontaneous or induced abortions were carried out using herbs such as rue, common rue, and pennyroyal, in concentrations that caused severe hemorrhaging. Maternal mortality in this specific population was estimated at approximately 1 death for every 5 pregnancies. Babies who survived birth were rarely raised by their biological mothers. Many were handed over to pagan temples, sacrificed in rituals such as those of Moloch, or simply abandoned at the rubbish dumps outside the city walls, where they died from exposure within a few hours. Archaeologists who excavated the entrance to the Valley of Hinnom, outside the walls of Jerusalem, found deep layers of ash mixed with fragments of infant bones. The bones correspond to children between the ages of 0 and 18 months. The prophet Jeremiah, chapter 19, verse 5, describes that site as the valley where they sacrificed their sons in fire to Baal. A significant portion of those children were the offspring of cult prostitutes or of marginalized women who had nowhere to go. The human cost was measured not only in the bodies of the mothers, it was measured in cradles that were never assembled. And there was the permanent public stigma. Observe the social identification rules in force. A prostitute could not wear a veil in the same way married women did. The text of Genesis chapter 38 verse 15 makes clear that Tamar was mistaken for a prostitute precisely because she had covered her face in a specific manner, demonstrating that there were distinct visual codes between the two female categories. Married women wore a full veil in public spaces as a sign of belonging to a household. Prostitutes wore clothing that left the face or shoulders more visible, or displayed specific adornments such as bronze earrings, bone bracelets, and perfumes based on myrrh and cinnamon. The text of Proverbs chapter 7 verses 10 to 12 describes exactly that pattern of appearance. It was a system of public marking. Walking through the city, anyone could identify from a distance who was one and who was the other. And that identification determined whether the woman was approached on the street, whether she could enter certain homes, whether she could come near the temple courtyards. The prostitute lived geographically inside the city, but socially beyond its borders. Witness now a singular narrative case recorded in the book of the prophet Hosea, approximately 750 years before Christ. God commands Hosea to marry a woman named Gomer, described by the text as a wife of whoredom. The purpose of that marriage was symbolic. The relationship between Hosea and Gomer would mirror the relationship between God and the people of Israel, unfaithful to the covenant. They had 3 children. Gomer left Hosea and returned to the circuit of houses. At a certain point, the text describes her as being sold as a slave at a public auction, presumably indebted to one of her clients or to a procurer. And Hosea, by divine command, went to the auction. He paid 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley, as recorded in chapter 3, verse 2. He bought back his own wife, and he brought her home again. The price of 15 shekels was equivalent to half the value of a common female slave in that period, which indicates that Gomer had already lost much of her market value through age, illness, or physical deterioration. Hosea paid for the ruined woman the equivalent of 8 to 12 months' wages of a median rural laborer, and his act became a permanent theological metaphor. The God who pays the price to redeem whoever has been sold. The redemption that reaches toward those the world has already discarded. That image would travel 800 years and reappear in the letters of the New Testament as the central language of redemption. Examine one more rarely discussed aspect. Male prostitution also existed in the Old Testament, though on a smaller scale. The text of Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 18 explicitly mentions the Kedeshim, male cultic prostitutes connected to pagan temples. The kings of Judah, Asa, and Jehoshaphat are recorded in the books of Kings as having expelled that category from the land. But with each successive generation, the practice returned. King Josiah, in the second book of Kings chapter 23 verse 7, tore down the houses of the Kedeshim that stood beside the temple in Jerusalem, where women wove garments for the goddess Asherah. The eradication of that practice was never definitive during the Israelite monarchic period. It appeared and kept appearing until the Babylonian exile. The persistence had a direct economic cause. Pagan temples profited directly from cultic prostitution. Pagan merchants profited from common prostitution along caravan routes, and impoverished fathers continued selling daughters every year of drought, every failed harvest, every locust plague. The cycle was structural, not individual, and then came the early old age. Follow the fate of a prostitute who managed to survive past 30. It was rare, but it happened. The body no longer held market value. The chronic diseases had already left their visible mark: thinning hair, hardened skin, absent teeth. With no family to take her in and no legitimate children to provide for her, she faced three final pathways. The first was to become the servant of a younger prostitute, preparing food, washing clothes, watching the house. The second was to become a beggar at the city gates, depending on the ritual almsgiving demanded by the Mosaic law in texts such as Leviticus chapter 19, verse 10. The third was to die of hunger or exposure in some anonymous alley, to be buried in a common grave outside the city walls, without name, without headstone, without record, without a name. But Scripture, contrary to what one might expect, preserves names: Tamar, Rahab, Gomer. The two anonymous women of Solomon's judgment are given direct voice in the text, their dialogue recorded, a royal decision shaped by their words. Christ himself, according to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 21 verse 31, would say to the religious leaders of his time a phrase that would resound like a cultural earthquake: "The tax collectors and the prostitutes enter the kingdom of God before you." It was a deliberate, provocative declaration directed at those who considered themselves pure by birth and ritual practice. The most marginalized category of woman in the social structure of ancient Israel appeared, in the words of the Messiah himself, as forerunner of the kingdom, and the echo of that phrase was not accidental. The genealogy of the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1 lists 4 women before Mary: Tamar, the daughter-in-law who dressed as a prostitute to claim justice; Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute of Jericho; Ruth, the foreign Moabite woman; Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, entangled in adultery with King David. 4 women connected in different ways to transgression, to stigma, or to social scandal, and those were the ones chosen by the evangelist as ancestors of the Messiah, alongside the patriarchs. The document that opens the New Testament begins by setting down names that the society of the period preferred to forget. Consider the impact of that literary gesture. The Gospel of Matthew was written for a predominantly conservative Jewish audience, well acquainted with the ritual purity laws of Leviticus. To list those 4 women in the Messiah's family tree was a deliberate theological choice. The lineage of promise was not constituted solely by pious men or irreproachable women. It passed through desperate widows, through foreign prostitutes, through women in morally ambiguous circumstances, and it still arrived at its destination. The house of David was born with scarlet threads hanging from the windows of prostitutes. This is the complete picture that emerges from a careful reading of the Old Testament. Prostitutes lived in dark houses, ate poorly, died young, were marked by specific adornments, surveilled by the law, condemned by the prophets, exploited by the pagan temples. But they also entered royal palaces for judgment. They hid spies on their rooftops. They were redeemed by prophets acting on divine command. They appeared by name in the genealogy of the Messiah. They were declared by Christ himself to be forerunners of the kingdom. The story that the biblical text tells about this specific category of woman does not fit into a simple frame. It does not romanticize prostitution. It does not erase the concrete suffering it entailed. It does not conceal the social stigma that weighed on those women for the rest of their lives. But it does not reduce them to objects of pure condemnation either. They are given voice, given agency, given names. And what that anonymous woman in Solomon's palace could not have imagined as she walked back home with the living child in her arms was that her scene would be read aloud in synagogues, churches, and universities for approximately 3,000 years without interruption, that her pain would be preserved in one of the most influential texts in the history of Western civilization, that her choice to prefer her son's life over her own honor would serve as an example of authentic maternal love for hundreds of generations to come. She could not see it, could not hear it, would never know, And yet, there, in that exact moment, she was participating in the construction of something far greater than herself. A narrative arc that connects Jericho to Jerusalem, Tamar to Mary, the scarlet thread in the window to the torn veil of Calvary. Each of those women left a trace, some only a single phrase, others a son. One of them, a red cord that became a permanent symbol of protection in the middle of judgment. And what remains of that portrait is a truth difficult to carry. No life is disposable when seen from the right angle. No desperate choice entirely erases the worth of the person who made it. No social mark, however brutal, renders the final verdict on who that soul was before eternity. The prostitutes of the Old Testament lived under some of the worst material conditions the ancient world could produce. They died young. They were forgotten by most official records. But Scripture, against every custom of its time, chose to remember them. And in remembering them, it changed the way humanity would think about human dignity from that point forward. Their story does not end in the common graves outside the city walls. It ends, in truth, inside the very name of the Messiah.